Today Africa Podcast is a podcast series where we interview African entrepreneurs and professionals and share the stories behind their businesses. In each interview, we ask how they got started, how they grew, and how they run their business today. The stories are inspiring and also provide specific advice and insight into starting a business. By sharing these stories, we want to help others get started.
Tell me more about yourself.
My name is John. I'm the founder of Safiri Salama, basically co-founder. There are two other co-founders. My background is in communications. Basically, I've been a journalist, a producer, a marketer, a TV anchor, a sports commentator, then went into communication strategy and spent quite a bit doing that. And then at a ripe age of 48, decided to pivot into tech. So I will say almost over 28 years of experience in different aspects of the communication industry. So at 52, I'm embodiment that tech is not for the old. It's not for the young only. I guess it's basically what I feel. What I feel is that what I'm doing now is a collection. It's a sum of collective experiences that I've encountered in my journey as a journalist, as an advertiser, as a broadcaster, as a communication strategist. So basically, this is a culmination of that.
All right. Okay. What inspired you to start Safiri Salama, and how did you identify the need of innovation in African traditional death care industry?
We can start with it was an accidental discovery. Okay. I would the only thing that goes for it is that I've never been exactly traditional in my outlook. Even when I was in communication, when we ran our agency, we used to call it a guerrilla agency. Basically, we operated so much outside the mainstream. And even as a journalist, I was never fully hired. When I did the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, when I did Reuters, I was always a freelance because I preferred actually trying to see things a different way. Anyway, personally, I have a 24-year-old son, turning 24 this year. And when he was 18, one of the things that we were discussing, because we consider 18 to be the rite of passage year, it was that he couldn't, as he tried to find out who he was, his tribe, his ethnicity, his identity, and the issue of his grandfather came up. And my father, his grandfather, died when he was 4 years old, so he could hardly remember who he was. And the fact that he had also lived outside the country, he went to school in a neighboring country, he could hardly speak vernacular. And so his quest for identity was very important for him. And in the process, he asked some very piercing questions: who we are, what we are like, what makes him different. And the other question that came up was, what can I tell him about his grandfather, his community? And the one thing that came across was that there was very little that was taught to help him. And one of the big questions he asked is, why isn't Granddad online? Because I gave the lame excuse of, well, in 2003 when he passed on, the internet was not such a big thing. And he was like, but history is online. The rest of history is online. Okay. And so my father was a historian. And that by itself was an indictment of me having let his memory slide. So I actually looked for a couple of things I could do, like build a private website, because I'd worked in an advertising agency, so I knew all about design and stuff. However, immediately I tried to check whether there were good existing websites that could accommodate his memorial. I realized most of them were actually based so much on a Western orientation. I just put together a small website template, a WordPress template for him as a memorial website. And in the process, actually, I managed to get something that would put together his history, because he had ailed for long before he died, and he took time to actually pen down his biography in an exercise.
Wow.
So that was a good start. I mean, it was everything, including how many cows he had made for dairy for my mother, and all sorts of things and this kind of stuff. It made for very interesting reading, because he had left this book with us as a family. But once somebody is buried, we hardly go back there to actually dig in. But after putting this together, and that included now ferreting around to find these pictures, which were in all sorts of storage modes, I talked to a couple of friends about this, and they suggested, you know what, John, maybe this is a service that other people could use, because actually we all we don't store the history of our fathers and grandfathers. We normally put them in something called the funeral booklet or the memorial booklet, but after the funeral, nobody knows where it goes. And where do all those pictures? And so in asking around, people are like, why don't you actually turn this into a service that people can use? And so I reached out to different people, including a bereaved family, on would you use this? Would you use it? Because all it had was, a memorial where you could have pictures and notifications for when the memorial and birthdays are, and a place where to put tributes and a place where to put pictures. But the first reaction I got when I dealt with the family was, it's important, but it's not the most important thing today. Because they were freshly bereaved, and they were like, I don't think for us storing memories would be the biggest thing we want to do now. What we are trying to do is to raise money to bury a person, coordinate people, make funeral arrangements, and basically they were more immediate about what they needed. And my thinking was, that was the first reality check on whatever idea I had. And I found that very entertaining, because that is a market check. And so what they were saying, we are used to death notices and we're used to funeral announcements. Is this a funeral announcement? And so went back into memorials, looked like a good idea, but they were suggesting we needed to announce a death, and the announcements that were existing in the market were very expensive. And so it led me into another phase of what actually were the issues around the market. You realize obituaries were so expensive, less than 10% of people were using them in newspapers and on radio. Yet one of the most important aspects of any culture in Africa is the first step is to announce a death. And so we said, actually do it. But the other thing you realize, why were obituaries more expensive? Newspapers had shrunk in readership, radio stations were much more fragmented, it made it much more expensive. So people were resorting to either putting death announcements on Facebook, which were not suited for it, or putting it on WhatsApp, creating WhatsApp groups. Then something else that was coming up, people are complaining about not just the cost, but the ownership of the death notice. Most newspapers own the notice. You pay them, they float the notice for you. You want to amend it, you pay again. And so you actually don't control it.
Again.
Then something else that comes is that death notices in the newspapers and on radio are not stored in a retrievable manner. Basically, you'll find lots of radio stations read out the funeral announcements live, and most newspapers actually float it for the day and don't put an online version of it. So if you wanted to retrieve it, you actually can't. An issue came there, especially when you understood that death notices were not just about announcing a death, they were the history of a person. It detailed family members, who the person was. And so we said, why don't we create a modern version of a death notice that is digital, that's online, that is shareable, that is cheaper, and which can be owned by the family, and it's a one-off payment.
Okay.
And so that our foray into doing that, and later on we've improved it. We said, normally Africans don't really bury within cities that much in cemeteries, they bury up country. So why don't you actually provide maps for burying, for directing people who are coming for the funeral? When COVID came, it introduced the aspect of live streaming. So why don't you have your live streaming links there as well? So a couple of modifications we did to actually improve what a death notice can do.
Okay.
Then another issue came up when we figured out, when we talked to families and they were like, do you know what hurts us the most? It's the cost.
Okay.
The cost of finding suppliers, it's the time. It's terrible because we don't actually treat the funeral industry as a formal industry. And that means it's very fragmented. There are all sorts of suppliers in small outfits in all sorts of different places. And there are all sorts of services which you may need, but which are not actually classified as funeral services. I'll give you an example. The lawyer who writes a will is not actually seen as a member of the funeral industry. The person who actually does catering, the person who actually does event organization in Africa is not seen as part of the funeral industry. What are seen as part of the funeral industry are the people who provide the hearse, flowers, and funeral homes.
Yeah, and the caskets.
And the caskets. So we thought, and then one of the things that happened with this fragmentation, not serious marketing around it, a culture of silence in which you cannot advertise a funeral service or a product. I mean, go through mainstream media, you will never see advertisement about a funeral service.
Yeah, death is seen as a kind of a no-go area in Africa. Everybody's kind of scared of dying. Nobody wants to leave. Everyone wants to live here forever.
True. Yet it is the one thing that we all confront. And it's even worse than that, that when a death happens in the West, you have a funeral home to go to and a funeral director to help you plan. More like, the way you do wedding planning.
Yes.
In Africa, it is friends and family planning without any prior experience around it. What that exposes them to, there's a lot of time wasted because they have to physically go to see the supplies and the products. Like funeral coffins and caskets are made on this street. You have to physically go there. And that gave us the idea about how about beyond creating this funeral platform where you can do advertise, where you can have death notices, have memorials, why can't you also have a directory of funeral service providers? We call it the Red Book. So we ended up creating 3 products: death notices, memorials, and what we are calling the Red Book. Basically, the yellow pages of the death industry, but then very extensive because it includes lawyers, people who work directly in the industry, event organizers. We even found people who make funeral outfits, mobile toilets, people who stream, event directors, counseling. Grief counseling is part of that industry. So we thought, why don't we just have this one-stop place where people can go? Because while Africa is fast adopting technology and it's helping us how we buy, how we shop, how we find items, the death industry is untouched by technology. And as such, it makes organizing a funeral a traumatic experience. 1, you don't have the experience. 2, you don't have the time because burials have to happen within a specific period, and COVID brought this home. And within that period, you've got to make very many decisions without any guide or helpline. So that's what actually created Safiri Salama for us. Safiri Salama basically in Swahili means go well or travel well. It's a common phrase used during funerals.
How did you meet your co-founders, and what convinced you that they are the right partners to work with you?
I've always been in the media industry and the media business. And that's why I told you, I think what I'm doing now is a culmination, because having worked as a freelance journalist, having worked in the newsroom, having worked in production, having worked headed an advertising agency, one of the things you learn is that the people you partner is like a marriage. And I have always tended to fall back on people I have worked with before and worked it on different kinds of assignments so that you understand their temperament, their view about building stuff, their sense of adventure. And so for me, 2 years after I started the building the prototype, I actually went back to one person who was the head of management, who was administration head at my advertising agency, the one that I ran, Public Consulting Practice Group. And she's called Edith. I worked with Edith since she left college in 2007, 2008. When I was doing programming at broadcast station, she came in as an intern. She worked on one of my programs and she was pretty outstanding. And we offered her a job when she was done with college. And so we have like a partnership that has run over 17 years in different aspects. She's traveled outside the country, gone to do her double master's degree, but she came back home and I was like, let's complete what we started. Then while I was working with different clients, I ended up also engaging an actuarian scientist who would actually work with a lot of clients with regard to predicting sales, working the numbers, crunching the numbers. He's Steve. And I reached out to Steve and I said, look, I'm trying something here that's really unique. I'll need to have a very good perspective of it. I'll need to have a very good outlook of the numbers, because if we are going to do a tech business that's dealing with this, we need to have the right information. And so that's how both Steve and Edith came on board as co-founders of Safiri Salama. So basically between us, we share over 17 years of knowing each other, which made it a bit easier.
When it comes to funeral, the cultural sensitivity surrounding it is quite huge. So how do you approach, building trust with customers and communities over there in Kenya?
That's actually the key question to understanding this whole, to having what we are calling a death tech. Many people say we are Africa's first tech. I was discussing this with an anchor friend of mine because we want to do a radio campaign later on in the year. And the first thing he said, you're not going to use such words on my show. I use words like farewell. I have a morning show about death. However, I think the first thing that you learn, having worked in the advertising industry and the communication industry, the first thing you learn is tone. The other thing you learn is about understanding an audience. Nobody may want to talk about death up front, but many people may want to talk about memorializing people they love. If the language is love, it's different. It's easy to talk about love. It's easy to talk about respect and honoring those who went before us. We normally have that in conversation. And that's exactly what the entire FINRO right is. It's a rite of passage. The other thing that we did was to actually adopt policies on our platform